This video was sponsored by Squarespace, the best place to build and host a website. Today I want to talk about how I made this scene of a post-apocalyptic New York street in Blender. I've been wanting to do a scene like this for a long time, and it's something that gets requested quite often. So I always start our projects by gathering loads of reference images. In this case I just jumped onto Google Street View and I started scouring Manhattan looking for a good spot. Eventually I came across this area at the corner of 6th Avenue and 32nd Street. I thought this was a good candidate because you get this nice contrast between the smaller buildings in the foreground, the mid-sized towers in the midground, and the huge skyscrapers in the background. Google Street View is a great place to find references, and I really like the fact that you can actually go back and look at older imagery as well. For instance, this building at the back here I thought looked a little bit ugly because it's got this glass front, but on the older imagery it didn't have that, so that's the way I modelled the building. I've never done any large outdoor building scenes like this before, and obviously I had a lot of buildings to make here, so to make my life a little bit easier I decided to keep all the buildings as modular as possible. So I started each building with just a single plane, and I used loop cuts to make the basic shape of a window, then I extruded that in. Then I added some extra cuts for the window's frame and I extruded in the glass panels. Then I just used an array modifier that would add extra windows along the floor, and I used a second array modifier set to the Z-axis which would add extra floors onto the building. For a bit of extra detail you can always add things like window sills or a frieze that goes around the building. The bevel tool set to the custom curve shape is a really good way to make decorative friezes really quickly. Most of the building materials were just basic PBR texture sets. Since the geometry is fairly flat, you can usually get away without using a proper UV map. Just go into the front view and select Cube Projection from the UV menu. This method has the added benefit of the fact that everything will be tileable, so you don't have to worry about trying to get bricks to line up. Then I just made a simple glass shader material for the windows, and I made another plain white material for the window frames. To tie everything together and make the building look like it's been overgrown by nature, I added my Quick Moss node group. This is a material node that I made for my Patreon followers quite a while back. I use it quite often. You can download it from my Patreon if you remember, though it's fairly easy to replicate something like this yourself. It's basically just a Musgrave node that defines where this green texture goes. To control how visible I wanted the moss to be, I just added in a mix shader and I mixed back in some of the original material with the moss, so then I could just use the slider to control how visible the moss would be. I obviously didn't want the buildings to look like some sort of cardboard cutout Potemkin village, so I needed to make some fake rooms behind the glass. Luckily it's very dark behind there, so it just had to be kind of black. So what I did is I just added a cube and I removed the face on the side that was facing the windows, then I gave it a rough black texture and I turned the specularity right down so hardly any light would bounce out of there. That means that any light that goes in doesn't really come out, and that also keeps the noise down in the glass. You can smash out some of the glass in the windows quite easily. I just applied the array modifier, then I found the piece of glass that I wanted to smash. I pressed P to separate it into its own object, then in edit mode for that object I used K to get up the knife tool and I started drawing out where I wanted the shards of glass to be, mostly around the edges of the frame. Then I selected the middle part of the glass and I deleted that. I added a little bit of thickness to the whole thing with the extrude tool because I found if it didn't have thickness it doesn't hit the light properly and it's really not very visible. After that I just needed to join it back up to the original mesh with Ctrl J, and I did that a bunch of times for every building. Obviously in order to make more walls all we have to do is select this wall mesh, duplicate it and then rotate it 90 degrees on the Z axis. Move it into place and you're pretty much done. You can align it exactly if you use the snapping tool set to vertex mode, and I only recently discovered that you can actually turn on snapping mode while you're in grab mode if you just hold down the control key. I don't know how I've never known about that before, but it was a complete game changer for this project because I had to use it so many times. There's a flag flying outside the McDonald's and I knew straight away I definitely wanted that in the animation. It was fairly simple to make. I just added a face and scaled it down to be the correct shape with a few loop cuts. Try to make sure when you're doing cloth simulations that the loop cuts are evenly spaced out, so all the faces are pretty much square. You don't want to have faces that are much longer in one direction than the other way, or the cloth sim will look weird. Now we can select the 2 corner points of the flag and we can add those to a new vertex group. Once we add the cloth simulation, we can go down to the pin group and select the vertex group that we just made. What that'll do is it'll pin the cloth in place by those 2 corners. It doesn't do too much right now, but if we decrease the stretch value slightly, you can see that the cloth is sagging everywhere apart from those corners. The flag's also tethered to the building by a cable, and I knew I wanted that in the scene. I just did this by adding a loop cut to the bottom of the mesh, and I extruded out the shape of a cable which I gave like a metallic material. The bottom verts of this cable part were also added to the same vertex group as the corner pins, so the corner of the cable would be pinned in place too. Finally, we can add a little bit of life into the flag just by using the wind force effector and rotating it towards the flag. If you press play on the animation, absolutely nothing will happen. That's because by default, Blender sets the force to 1, when for every cloth simulation it almost always has to be much higher. Okay, maybe not that high, but you get the idea. It has to be pretty high. You can also manually keyframe the strength of the wind to make a more interesting dynamic simulation than just having the wind constantly blowing at the same force. You can also open up the graph editor once you've added in a keyframe, and if you press M you can get up the modifiers, then add a noise modifier, and that'll just constantly change the strength of the wind and it'll fluctuate through the whole simulation. I ran through a couple of test renders here just to see how the wind would look under different types of force effects. By the way, this test animation that you've just watched literally rendered out in the time that it took me to make a cup of coffee. In fact, here's the same shot from another angle rendering out at less than 3 frames per second with Cycles X, which is absolutely bonkers, and that's with screen recording software slowing it down too. It was actually more like 2 seconds. It's not particularly visible in the final render, but I thought that this worn out canvas material looked pretty nice, so I'll just quickly talk about that. I wanted it to kind of look like it was a bit threadbare, like it's very worn out and battered. So to make that, I just mixed the principal shader with some transparency, and I used this grunge texture as the factor of the transparency, so now the white parts would be slightly more see-through than the rest of the flag. The canvas threads themselves were made just by combining 2 wave textures, one of them's going horizontally and one of them's going vertically, and I just blended those together with a mix RGB node, and I used that as the input of a bump node. So after all that was done, it was basically just a case of blocking out all the other buildings on the street based on a few reference photos. I wasn't too interested about getting a perfect match for the real life buildings here. I mean, unless you're the owner of Toast Manhattan, I really doubt you care if it's a one-to-one recreation of how the building actually looks. It just had to look good enough. To block out the rest of the city, I mostly used photo scans of partially demolished buildings. Obviously, most photo scans are very heavy. Some of them have millions and millions of polygons, which is too much when you've got a lot of them in the scene. So I deleted any parts of the mesh that wouldn't be visible to the camera. I used the decipher modifier to massively bring down the number of polys, and I also used Boolean just to trim out anything that shouldn't be in the scene, like the construction equipment. I got most of the photo scans for this project from Sketchfab. I'll leave a link in the description to that website. Speaking of websites, you should check out the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. But be honest, you didn't see that one coming. Squarespace is a fantastic site where you can build and host your own professional website. If you want a portfolio site to showcase all that great artwork you've been making, well, they got you covered. They have these fantastic templates where you can automatically make a portfolio site with hardly any work. You want to sell your artwork as prints? Squarespace can help you there too. They even have integration tools so you can link print-on-demand services straight to your website. No website would be complete without a catchy name, and luckily for you, Squarespace has domain names too. Visit squarespace.com/decoded to start your free trial, and you'll get 10% off your first website or domain name registration using the code DECODED. Once all the photo scan city elements were in place, I added my mossy node group to every material to make it all look like it's been overgrown with ivy. For some of the buildings, I also used the original image texture as a really crude mask so I could make the window areas look like they were shiny glass. In the final composition, I felt like this Taco Bell building on the left was a little bit too distracting, so I shaped the light a bit with a flag. Flags are what photographers use to block out areas of light, allowing them to control where the shadows go. It's as simple as adding a plane into the scene and placing it in between the light and the object where you want the shadow to go. Make sure that you go into the object's visibility settings and uncheck everything but shadow. You really don't want a massive white plane showing up in the reflections of the buildings. I actually did a similar trick with the lighting itself. The light from the scene was lit by HDRI, but it had some visible trees in the distance, so to fix that I just went into the world shader and I mixed the HDRI image that I liked with another one that was just the plain sky. A light path node was added and I used this output called isCameraRay as the mix factor. What this does is it basically lights the scene with one HDRI, but another HDRI is visible in the background. So now I can choose any background image that I want and it won't affect the HDRI lighting. Ironically, I ended up changing the HDRI at the last minute and I messed this part up. I used another image that also had some visible trees, which I didn't notice at the time, but luckily they weren't really visible once the fog layer was added in compositing, so it wasn't worth going back and re-rendering out. I thought that the scene needed a little bit more life into it and a better sense of scale, so to do that I went back to Sketchfab and I got some photo scans of ruined cars. Then I just placed those around the scene where I thought they looked nice. I didn't spend a lot of time fixing these up, I just basically ran a decimate modifier on them so they weren't so high poly, and then I pretty much used just the base texture. The only difference that I made is I went around the glass part and I made those semi-translucent. The actual road itself was a little bit tricky because I couldn't decide how I wanted it to look. My first idea was to make it really cracked up, so I used a displacement modifier to add in some cracks. Then I could use a vertex group to control exactly where the displacement would be applied. That looked okay, but it didn't feel quite right, so I also tried sculpting in some cracks, and at one point I even considered adding like a big hole in the ground that was going to fill with water, but I thought it was just really distracting in the final composition. So in the end, I just used this fairly simple road texture. I made some road markings in Photoshop and I just put them onto a black background. Then I used this image as the factor of a mix shader so that I could add a second white material to make the paint markings on the road. Those looked okay, but they were obviously too perfect for the road surface. So to make it look worn out, I added a mix RGB shader between the image and the mix node, and I set that to multiply with a black color. Then I used a noise texture and a color ramp as the factor of this node. This allowed me to basically eat away at the paint markings so they would look worn out and cracked. You can just play around with the roughness and the scale and the color ramp positions and you'll get all sorts of different effects. So now the main scene's all done, I needed to add a little bit of set decoration. I used the TRAFFIQ and BOTANIQ add-ons for most of this. TRAFFIQ has a really great pack of street elements like road signs and fire hydrants. In BOTANIQ, I've talked about loads of times before, but it has these amazing plant elements like grass and trees and ivy. I'll link to both those add-ons somewhere in the description if you want to take a look. Once the grass assets were placed onto the road with a particle system, I tried to add a little bit more life into the scene with a wave modifier. Since this is a particle, you just need to apply the wave modifier to the original grass mesh and it'll be applied at every instance. The wave modifier by itself is a little bit repetitive, so what I usually do is I apply the wave modifier as a shape key, and then I use the noise modifier in the graph editor to control the strength of the waving motion so it changes all the time. I did a little test render with this and it wasn't really visible in the final scene since the camera's moving and the foreground is really out of focus anyway, so I decided just to remove it for the final render because it was slowing down playback and rendering speed. To be honest, I could make an entire video about all the things that I made and then didn't include in this final render. I knew that the tree on top of the building at the start of the animation was going to be very visible though, so that was worth animating. Luckily, most of the BOTANIQ trees come with preset animations where you can pick your level of wind and it just automatically gets applied as a breeze to all the leaves. Another quick way that I could breathe a little bit of life and some movement into this scene was to add a few curtains behind the broken windows. These were made just like I made the flag earlier. I just made a basic shape and I used vertex group to pin the top of the curtain to just above the window. There's already a wind effector in the scene for the flag, which means that I basically just had to bake the simulation and it was ready to go. So I spent about 5 hours rendering out the scene, which is pretty fast, but I did notice that I had a huge issue. The grass for some reason was being affected by an unknown force. I could fix this just by turning off all the force effects in the particle system. For some reason it was the gravity that was affecting things, not the wind or anything. I don't really know what that was all about. So once the grass was fixed, I could re-render out this project, and literally just before I hit render, I found out about this new geometry node group called IvyGen created by Baga. It adds procedural Ivy to any objects inside a group and you get tons of control over the way it behaves. It's free, but you can donate to Baga's Gumroad, and I really suggest you do because it's a very cool tool. However, it does add a lot of extra geometry to the scene, and I already had well over 4 million verts in this thing, so long story short, Blender just refused to render this animation out. It was way too taxing on the CPU, and even after I removed 1 million verts from the scene, it was still just freezing halfway through a frame. I would do 1 frame or 5 frames and it would just quit. Everything would freeze up and I would have to restart Blender. Eventually I went through all of the different collections to figure out what it was, and I figured out it was the IvyGen plants. You probably know where I'm going with this. I had to remove them from the render. The difference is this time I could put it back. You see, once it was rendered out, I could just render out a separate pass with the ivy and composite it back in later. However, if I just hid all the objects apart from the ivy and rendered it and then composited it in, you would see all the parts of the ivy that should be hidden behind signs or behind buildings. That wasn't going to work. I needed a way to mask out all the parts of the ivy that should be hidden. You can do this fairly simply in Blender using render holdouts. See, if you add an object to a group, you can enable holdout for that group setting. By default, this will just make all the objects in the group black. But if you go to film and enable transparency for the background, you'll get a transparent alpha layer where that object was. So I added every object in the scene to a new collection, and I made that collection unrenderable so it wouldn't show up, and I made it hold out so that it would be transparent. Then when I rendered out the ivy pass, any parts of the ivy that went behind those objects were invisible. Then I could just composite the ivy straight on top of the original footage, and I had all the right lighting and things that I should have. Ideally you would want to do an extra pass to add the shadows from the ivy back onto the buildings and things, but since all the ivy's up against a wall, I didn't really think it was necessary. I did a little bit of compositing in the Blender compositor, but it was all very simple. I just used the color balance node to slightly tweak the hues. Then I ran the image through a glare node just to increase the bright parts of the image. I used the depth paths as the factor of a mix node, and I just used that to add in a little bit of blue haze in the background. Finally, I mixed in the composited image with the original image set to multiply. That basically just crunches the black values while keeping all the light parts the same. Using the depth pass was actually a mistake. I had to swap that out for a mist pass later on. The problem with using the depth pass is it calculates the depth based on what's visible on the camera at that frame. So that means that the fog layer basically is going to change as the camera moves around, and all of a sudden things will just pop in and out of the fog. That doesn't happen with the mist layer because it goes off the distance from the camera. I also rendered out a pretty cool override pass of this scene. An override pass is basically just a render with one material. You can do that easily just by going to the override section of the renders layer tab, and you set whatever material you want all the objects to have. In this case I just used a principal shader set to the default settings. It's a really nice way to test out the lighting and the composition of the scene without being distracted by all the reflections and the materials. So thank you very much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And thank you very much to Squarespace for making this video possible in the first place. Remember to visit squarespace.com/decoded to get your free trial, and you'll get 10% off your first website or domain name registration with the code DECODED.